When we talk about the extraordinary moments that have shaped the course of history, we often focus on major decisions, powerful speeches, or dramatic turning points that took place in front of millions. But sometimes, history pivots in an instant, in a quiet, unexpected confrontation where one wrong move could change everything. The incident in which a police officer suddenly pulled a gun on John Kennedy is exactly that kind of moment. At first glance, it may seem like a tense misunderstanding or routine enforcement, but as we take a deeper look, we discover how this split-second event reveals the fragility of leadership, the volatility of power, and the hidden dangers lurking within even the most advanced societies. This story is more than just an isolated incident. It is a powerful reminder of how quickly the line between authority and chaos can disappear, and how a single decision, made in the heat of the moment, can leave a lasting impact on an entire nation. The thin line between authority and abuse of power becomes most apparent in moments of direct confrontation between those who hold institutional control and those who are subject to it. Authority, by its very nature, requires trust from the public and a recognition of legitimate use, yet it also carries the potential for misuse and escalation when driven by fear, bias, or misjudgment. In many situations, a uniform or official title can grant an individual the ability to make decisions that affect lives in an instant, but this does not automatically guarantee the wisdom or restraint needed to exercise that power responsibly. When an officer pulls a weapon, it is not just an individual action, it is the full force of an institution projected through a single person, and whether intended or not, it communicates not only authority but also a potential threat. People witnessing such a moment may interpret it as a reasonable protective measure or as an act of intimidation or aggression. The difference often lies not in the action itself but in the context, the motivations, and the precise way the power is executed. This is why there is such a delicate balance between enforcing laws and maintaining the public's trust. History shows that leaders, no matter how powerful or respected, are not immune to anxiety, misinterpretations, or human error in such intense situations. When John Kennedy faced a gun pulled by a police officer, it crystallized for many how fragile that boundary really is. Even a brief lapse in judgment or a misunderstood gesture could have potentially led to an irreversible disaster, threatening not only the life of a prominent figure but the stability of an entire government structure at that moment. From the perspective of the officer, the situation might have appeared dangerous, requiring immediate, decisive action to prevent a perceived threat. However, from the perspective of others present, that same action could be viewed as overreach, amplified by the symbolic weight of pointing a weapon at someone who represented the will of the people. These kinds of incidents force society to confront the question of how much power should be entrusted to any individual and how checks and training should be designed to reduce the risk of escalation. The expectations placed on law enforcement are exceptionally high, especially when the safety of national leaders is involved. And yet even with strict protocols and procedures, the outcome still depends on the emotional and psychological state of the individual in that moment. One of the most difficult aspects of authority is that it often functions on quick judgments made in stressful situations, where mistakes can occur regardless of experience or training. The tension of such a moment is further intensified when the subject is not an ordinary citizen but a symbol of national unity, progress, or hope. In John Kennedy's case, the incident exposed not only the vulnerability of a leader but also the underlying tension of a society whose institutions must operate under continuous pressure. It raises the question of how law enforcement officials internalize their roles and responsibilities during encounters with figures of authority themselves. On the one hand, they are sworn to protect, uphold, and ensure peace and order, but on the other hand, they must navigate their own instincts and judgments, which can be clouded by numerous factors ranging from political polarization to unspoken anxieties about potential dangers. Because of this complexity, it becomes almost inevitable that such a narrow separation between authority and abuse has to be carefully monitored and continuously discussed. Each generation must re-examine the duties and limits of those in power and recognize that unchecked authority, even when driven by good intentions, can easily drift into actions that erode public trust. The fact that someone like John Kennedy could find himself in such a vulnerable position illustrates how no one is completely protected from the consequences of even a momentary imbalance of power. At the core of this issue lies the human element. Fear, instinct, responsibility, and perception all merge during these critical seconds. A simple command, a misinterpreted movement, or an ambiguous verbal exchange can create a chain reaction that turns a controlled scenario into a potential crisis. Authority without empathy or careful restraint can quickly become oppressive, even if the intention is to maintain order. Many people often assume that abuse of power occurs only in situations of deliberate cruelty or corruption, but more often it arises in everyday moments where power is misapplied due to a lack of emotional regulation or situational awareness. While official policies and systems play a role in protecting with fairness, it is the individual who must choose how to apply those policies in real time. The officer holding the gun might believe they are preventing harm, but if their interpretation of the situation is inaccurate, their actions become a form of abuse even if they do not recognize it in that moment. This is why constant training, transparency, and accountability are crucial in preserving the integrity of authority. They remind those in power that they are being watched not only by those around them but by history. The thin line exists and remains fragile because authority depends entirely on its consistent application and its perceived legitimacy. Once the public senses that those in power are using their position to intimidate or control rather than to protect and serve, the trust that upholds the entire structure of governance begins to dissolve. When a gun is pointed at someone like John Kennedy, it does not only create a moment of personal danger, it sends shockwaves through societal consciousness, challenging the belief that leadership ensures safety. Instead, it reveals that even the most respected figures can be reduced to targets if authority loses its moral restraint. This recognition often sparks broader debates about how power is delegated and controlled. It forces citizens to question whether the institutions that are supposed to protect them are functioning properly or if they have become tools of fear. The power dynamic between enforcer and subject becomes an uncomfortable mirror reflecting how society views itself and what it is willing to accept. In events like these, many people begin to reflect on what safeguards should be put in place to ensure such dangerous near misses do not occur again. They think about how emotional intelligence and communication training might prevent similar incidents, and whether new protocols are needed to de-escalate high-risk encounters. The issue becomes not just the moment itself but what it implies about the broader culture of power. Authority must be accompanied by consistent reminders that it is merely a temporary responsibility lent by the public, not a permanent license to exert force. In uncertain or highly charged situations, humility and respect become essential tools in preventing the slide from legitimate control into oppressive behavior. People start to see that the real test of leadership or enforcement is not how forcefully one can act, but how measured and thoughtful one can be in restraint while still addressing potential threats. A single moment has the power to redefine how people view a leader, shifting opinions that may have been built over months or even years of public service and turning respect into doubt or skepticism in the blink of an eye. When someone in a leadership position faces a sudden critical incident, such as John Kennedy having a gun pulled on him by a police officer, public perception can be altered because people instinctively evaluate how that leader reacts under pressure, what kind of composure they maintain, and whether they embody the qualities they claim to represent. In this case, it is not only the forceful action of an officer that draws attention but also how Kennedy carries himself in the face of danger. People are naturally drawn to moments that reveal the true character of a leader, and often they are more influenced by visual and emotional impressions than by long, calculated policy speeches. An unexpected confrontation creates an intense, highly focused atmosphere in which every action, gesture, or word becomes amplified in the public eye. Personal composure during such a moment becomes a test that determines whether a leader is perceived as courageous, calm, and resilient or as vulnerable and uncertain. The public often compares these reactions to their own expectations of how a leader should behave, and this comparison frequently influences opinion far more than any previous accomplishments or good intentions. When society witnesses a leader in a life-threatening situation, it is not just about the physical danger being faced but about the emotional and symbolic weight of the moment. A split-second decision by a leader, such as remaining calm or showing empathy even while being threatened, can inspire admiration and belief in their strength. Conversely, if they panic or appear overwhelmed, it can plant seeds of doubt and weaken their overall authority in the eyes of countless observers. People want leaders who remain steady when everything around them becomes unstable, and the difference between praise and condemnation often lies within seemingly minor actions that happen during a matter of seconds. These instances of sudden crisis become deeply etched into public memory and are often revisited by commentators, historians, and ordinary citizens as defining landmarks in a leader's life. Even long after the event, the moment continues to shape narratives and affect how people evaluate that leader's capabilities. The power of a single moment lies in its ability to reveal truths that routine appearances and scripted speeches attempt to manage or conceal. People recognize that plans and messaging can be rehearsed, but genuine reactions under extreme pressure cannot be faked without perceptible cracks. As a result, there is an almost subconscious reliance on these moments of honesty to guide public opinion. This is why even casual onlookers who previously paid little attention to political developments can suddenly become engaged and form strong opinions based on a single televised or recorded incident. A dramatic confrontation often draws widespread media coverage and becomes a focal point for analysis and debate, emphasizing behaviors and statements that might not have seemed significant at the time they occurred. In the case of John Kennedy, the incident with the police officer not only created instant shock but also raised questions about the relationship between leadership and law enforcement, as well as the vulnerability of those who serve in highly visible roles. Many individuals may have seen this event as a reminder that leadership entails risks that cannot always be controlled, reinforcing a sense of admiration for individuals who willingly face such dangers in service to their country. At the same time, the event can spark criticism over whether adequate protection was in place, if communication protocols failed, or if the officer's actions were indicative of deeper systemic issues. All of these questions contribute to a broader reevaluation of leadership. People start to look at whether a leader is actively working to address flaws in the system that allowed such a moment to occur and whether they demonstrate transparency in reflecting on the experience. Public perception, once shifted by a sudden event, can also influence the future behavior of the leader. They may feel compelled to adapt their public approach to regain confidence or emphasize aspects of their character that appeared strong during the incident. The concept of leadership is not static, it evolves in response to events and the way individuals internalize and interpret them. A critical moment becomes a shared experience in which the public collectively decides what kind of leader they want and whether the current figure meets those expectations. In some cases, this confrontation can elevate the status of the leader, as resilience and dignity in adversity can reinforce public trust. People draw inspiration from seeing their leader face a direct threat and remain at ease, and this often strengthens emotional connections that go beyond political alignment. Families, communities, and individuals talk about the event, share their interpretations, and solidify their opinions in ways that might not happen during normal, uneventful periods. In other cases, however, the confrontation may expose vulnerabilities or provoke anxiety among observers who feel that the leader is not sufficiently protected or assertive, triggering debate over whether a different leader might handle similar situations more effectively. The idea that one crucial moment can reshape everything is tied to the psychological nature of storytelling. People contextualize their reality through stories and symbolic images, and a dramatic incident is immediately integrated into a broader narrative about the leader's identity. This narrative quickly becomes part of public consciousness and affects the way future actions are interpreted. Every decision the leader makes after such a moment is seen through the lens of the prior incident. If they demonstrate consistency with the calm or courage shown at that time, perception remains positive. If they contradict it, even unintentionally, that inconsistency may deepen doubts or erode trust. Reshaping public perception does not necessarily require a long sequence of events or complex political developments. It can begin with a single gesture or choice in the heat of the moment, such as choosing to speak in a measured tone instead of reacting aggressively when threatened. These subtle differences are often missed in everyday situations but become magnified when millions of eyes are watching. The public, consciously or unconsciously, uses these moments as evidence to evaluate whether the leader's image aligns with their actual behavior. Traditional leadership qualities such as wisdom, strength, patience, and decisiveness are no longer abstract concepts but become very real and visible. What matters is not what the leader claims to stand for but how they behave when tested. Therefore, even long after the moment has passed, it remains a major reference point for evaluating leadership and continues to influence discussions, not only in news cycles but in classrooms, documentaries, and personal conversations. A single incident that exposes the leader to danger and reveals their reaction can either reinforce a strong bond between the public and their leader or cause that bond to fracture. The process is gradual but powerful, as it often includes reflections on how the event made people feel, what they believe it reveals about their society, and whether there is alignment between the leader's public image and their true character. The importance of calm decision-making in high-pressure situations becomes evident when one considers how easily chaos can emerge in moments of uncertainty, especially when individuals in positions of authority must respond quickly to perceived threats. In these moments, the difference between escalation and resolution often hinges on whether the decision-maker remains composed enough to assess the situation accurately rather than reacting out of fear, instinct, or preconceived assumptions. When a police officer suddenly finds themselves face to face with a high-profile individual like John Kennedy in a scenario charged with tension, it is natural for adrenaline to surge and for perceptions to blur, yet it is precisely in such circumstances that calm and measured thinking becomes not only desirable but vital. Without calm, small misunderstandings can be magnified into explosive confrontations as individuals rely on instinct rather than deliberate thought. And instinct in these cases is frequently accompanied by apprehension, bias, or distorted judgment. Calm decision-making is the process of staying mentally centered enough to separate actual threat from imagined danger, even when the stakes are high and time is limited. It involves the ability to slow down one's mental processes amid the external urgency and remain open to alternative interpretations of what is happening. For example, if the officer who pulled a gun on John Kennedy had allowed panic to drive their actions unchecked, it could easily have triggered a chain reaction involving other officers, bystanders, or Kennedy's own security. Yet a calm individual, although alert and aware of the risks, is able to evaluate body language, tone of voice, and context to determine whether lethal force is justified. Calm is not the absence of emotion but rather the disciplined containment of emotion so that sensible options remain visible and accessible. In the training of law enforcement and leadership alike, there is often an emphasis on procedures and protocols, but the most effective protocols still depend on the psychological state of the people implementing them. Calm decision-making enables the brain to remain flexible, drawing on prior training and experience without becoming locked into a tunnel vision mindset. The more some individuals feel the pressure of the moment rising, the more they can become trapped by a single narrative of danger that forecloses other possibilities, especially if they lack emotional control. In contrast, a calm approach allows for small details to emerge that might suggest the situation is not as threatening as originally feared. This ability to perceive nuance is essential in preventing tragic mistakes, particularly when dealing with an influential figure whose every action may be watched, recorded, and subsequently analyzed by thousands or millions of people. When John Kennedy was confronted with a drawn gun, any rash movement could have been misread as aggression or attempted escape, while any provocative language could have heightened the officer's sense of danger. Calm decision-making on Kennedy's part allowed him to remain still, composed, and verbally cooperative, which in turn gave the officer a chance to reconsider the necessity of escalation. People who stay calm in high-pressure situations often help regulate the emotional climate around them, de-escalating tensions through their very presence and behavior. Other individuals take subtle cues from how a leader behaves, and if that leader sustains a calm tone and steady posture, it encourages others to do the same. This effect is not limited to direct interpersonal interactions but also extends to the broader society that later hears about or watches these events. Calm decision-making can become a model that reinforces collective expectations about how leaders and authorities should respond to crises. In contrast, impulsive decisions taken in fear often lead to regret, severe consequences, or public outrage, leaving lasting scars both for the individuals involved and for institutional credibility. To achieve calmness in high-pressure circumstances, individuals generally need focused training in emotional awareness and stress management. This could include mental rehearsal, mindfulness practices, or regular exposure to simulated high-stress scenarios that teach them to maintain composure under pressure. Without this preparation, even well-intentioned people risk being overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of a real crisis. Calmness also depends on having a clear sense of purpose and values, which serve as internal anchors when the outside world becomes unpredictable. A person who deeply understands the responsibility entrusted to them is more likely to pause and think before acting, recognizing that their decision is not only about their own safety but about the safety and dignity of others. In the moment that the officer raised the gun at John Kennedy, the line between correct judgment and disastrous mistake could not have been thinner. Yet the potential for crisis to erupt was significantly reduced by the ability of both the officer and Kennedy to manage their emotional reactions enough to prevent unnecessary escalation. Calmness made it possible for both parties to access rational thought amid the tension. The importance of this capacity extends beyond law enforcement and politics into everyday life. In emergencies, medical professionals must make rapid but thoughtful choices, pilots must evaluate a cascade of potential failures without succumbing to panic, and parents must respond to sudden danger involving their children with both clarity and urgency. Calm decision-making is a universal skill with consequences that can be life-saving. One of the most profound aspects of calmness is that it allows people to remain self-aware in the heat of the moment, which prevents them from being consumed by reactive impulses. It also invites empathy, making it possible to recognize the humanity of others even when they appear to pose a threat. This does not mean ignoring danger, but understanding it in a broader context so that one responds appropriately rather than reflexively. In the John Kennedy situation, calmness fostered a chance for recognition between the parties involved, the officer recognizing Kennedy as a citizen and leader rather than an anonymous potential threat, and Kennedy recognizing the officer as someone attempting to fulfill a difficult duty rather than as an aggressor. This mutual recognition would not have been possible if either individual had been overtaken by panic or anger. Calm decision-making also builds long-term trust in institutions. People want to know that those who hold power in critical roles will not act recklessly under pressure, and that reassurance helps maintain social stability. The public feels safer when they see that leaders and officers remain composed in moments of crisis, because it indicates that decisions are made with thoughtful consideration rather than uncontrolled emotion. Ultimately, calmness is a mindset that must be cultivated and protected so that it becomes second nature during times of stress. By emphasizing calm decision-making in training and cultural expectations, societies can reduce the likelihood of unnecessary harm and strengthen the integrity of public leadership.